Hello, I'm Perrin Beatty, CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to the Business of Business. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we're having a series of conversations with experts about the aspects of the pandemic and how it affects Canadian businesses. We're very fortunate today to have Lou Smyrlis, who's the Managing Director of Newcom Trucking and Supply Chain Group. Lou is extremely well qualified to talk about the subject of supply chains. He's been a reporter who has reported on transportation issues for over 30 years. Welcome. We're delighted to have you, Lou.
Thank you, Perrin. Great to be here.
There's a great deal of talk today about the impacts of COVID-19 on supply chains. Tell us why supply chains are so important to our economy.
Well, you're right. If supply chains weren't already a boardroom topic, they definitely are now. Why is the issue of supply chain so important? Why is it that Canadians really need to understand the concept of supply chain? It's because supply chains really represent that web of activity that needs to happen in order for all the products that we need as a society to A, get produced, and B, be transported to all the places that we go to, grocery stores, et cetera, the car dealers, et cetera, where we go to buy them. Now, the interesting thing about all this is that Canadians rarely have to think about supply chain. Why? Because supply chains in the Western world are so good, so efficient, that they've essentially become invisible. It's like turning on your TV set. Most of us have no clue how our TVs work, myself included. All we know is that we just, click it on and it works. But like TVs, supply chains are much more complicated than we realize. So if I can just create a visual picture for you. Imagine a web with each thread in that web, with each thread at the top of that web, reflecting a particular ingredient or part that needs to travel from its place of origin to the center of that web, where it's going to come together with other products or other parts and be made into something. Let's take a simple example, a loaf of bread. Now, in this simple loaf of bread that Canadians would just go to the store and pick out of a shelf, and that's the only thought they would give to it. In this simple loaf of bread are more than 20 ingredients. Now, those ingredients, all 20 of them, they must all get to that place of production at the right time and in the right quantity. In addition to that, they also must be of the right quality and at a price that allows that bread to be produced at a profit. Now, something more complicated like a computer or a car, obviously it has thousands of parts that need to be brought together. So that's the production end. Now, imagine all the threads leading out from the center of the web where the production just happened. Each of those threads now represents the many destinations a product must get distributed to across the country, perhaps across the world, so that it can be sold. So as you can see, that web of activity is extremely complicated. Now, what's the test of a supply chain? It's resiliency in the face of a crisis, because any break in a thread has an impact on the entire supply chain. Break enough threads, and if you can't repair them fast enough, then that entire web or supply chain can unravel. And that's kind of what we're starting to face right now. Many Canadian companies have supply chains that span across not only interprovincial barriers, but across international borders. And right now, there are more than 200 countries and territories that are reporting cases of coronavirus. And therefore, there are possibilities within each and every one of those of supply chain disruptions. If we look just at China, the world's second largest economy, basically went dark for a period of weeks at the start of this. Its Wuhan region had to basically be shut down. And yet, it's a large producer of parts and raw materials that go into the products that Chinese companies make and then ship over to North America. So you can see, how quickly this kind of impact can be felt.
So in good times, what you have is the most efficient supplier, so the cheapest
Mhm.
inputs you can get for your business. And you have
Mhm.
supply chains that are resilient, so it means that you're able on a just-in-time basis to be able to get the inputs that you need. In bad times, it starts to break down. And what are the alternatives? How can people protect themselves against this?
Well, I mean, let me just go to backtrack a little bit in kind of explaining how we got here, because how we got here actually made sense. And this is a trend that's actually been going on for 3 decades, which is driven by that consumer appetite for low price goods, which in turn forces companies to look for ways to reduce their manufacturing costs. So for products that have a high value relative to their shipping cost, it makes a great deal of sense to produce them in China or East Africa or East Asia, and then ship them to where they're going to be purchased. And that's why our supply chains have become so global. In addition to that, or aside to that, is that there's this growth in trying to reduce costs by subcontracting. So supply chains now are very deeply tiered, where we have suppliers drawing upon suppliers, drawing upon suppliers. It's not uncommon to see companies or supply chains that have tiers that are 3 and 4 deep.
Highly specialized.
And yeah, exactly. And as you mentioned earlier, we've introduced lean and just-in-time production methods to support these global supply chains. Why did we do that? Well, because they were working so well. Our supply chains were so efficient, so inexpensive that we thought, okay, we can apply the lean and just-in-time production methods to reduce costs even further. And until now, this optimized, low-cost supply chain gave us a competitive advantage. It was a good thing. It was a thing to strive for. But now, it may actually represent our single largest business risk. So, you asked, who's at risk? Well, the supply chain disruptions that were particularly acute at the start of the pandemic were in the electronics and in the automotive industries because of the obvious ties to China for those industries. But then that started to spread. It spread into pharmaceuticals. It spread into metals. It's spreading now into consumer products. If you're relying on a global supply chain and therefore global transportation methods, for example, air cargo, that too is now coming under stress. What a lot of people don't know is that a great deal of air cargo actually moves in passenger planes. While we're sitting there in our seats and thinking that it's just our luggage that's underneath us in the belly of the plane, actually that's not true. About 50% of air cargo movements are done through passenger airplanes. So we're in a situation now where there's a lot, governments have cut back on international travel. And as a result, international carriers themselves have dropped back on the number of flights. That has a real impact on companies that were depending on air cargo to get their products. I also really worry about smaller companies, and really that's a Canadian story right there, because small and medium-sized companies, as you know, are the heart of the Canadian economy. Now, the challenge that they have is that they probably have the least bargaining power and possibly the least experience when it comes to looking for alternate sources for their parts and for their raw materials. So if, let's say they were dealing with a particular region in China that got shut down, now them having to go look for that part or that ingredient somewhere else is not so easy for a small company. The other challenge for them is on the other end of it. because demand has shrunk, they have to hold more and more inventory. They're stuck with more and more inventory. And inventory is a carrying cost at the worst possible time because their revenues are down. So you got this imbalance happening that makes their their profit lines not look very good.
So it can be a perfect storm then under those circumstances.
Yes.
Looking at potential threats to supply chains, we're talking about COVID-19 as being an example where production in China was shut down. So you have disease, you have political decisions. We're looking at pandemic protectionism at the present time, where countries are putting on export controls, including the President of the United States putting controls on ventilators, N95 respirators rather, coming out of the United States into Canada. So political decisions. Terrorism could possibly be a threat. Collapse of transportation systems or of telecom systems presumably could be as well. So a number of different potential vulnerabilities, of which COVID-19 is perhaps the most virulent that we've seen to date, but only one.
Yes.
How then can we protect ourselves against this?
Well, the first thing that I would say is to keep in mind that we have been through this before. We have had other crises that we've experienced, 9/11, the Japanese earthquake and tsunami back in 2011, the ongoing battle trade war between the US and China. So we have been through this before. Our supply chains did adjust. We did make it through. What's different about this one is just how widespread it is and how deep it is. We just haven't seen anything hit like this pandemic has. So how do we make it through? Well, I think we should take this opportunity to use this as a wake-up call, to understand that as good as our supply chains are, our global supply chains are, we really need to take a closer look at how to make them more resilient. And I would say there are three things that we need to consider. Number one, we need to reassess, each company needs to reassess its supply chain vulnerability. So if carrying inventory obviously is a cost, but if you're manufacturing something that is really complicated, perhaps needs certification, supply chain disruption is a clear threat to your business. And so carrying excess inventory as a safety buffer, that maybe adds to your costs, but it really may be worth considering as a way for you to be able to continue operating through a crisis.
It's risk management.
Number two is, exactly, yeah. I think part of what's happened is that we've had too much focus on cost control and not enough on the other things that, as you said, can all of a sudden throw the entire equation out the window. The second thing that I would suggest is assessing the financial and operational health of your suppliers. So ramp up any efforts that you currently have to monitor the countries that you're dealing with and also all the different suppliers that you're dealing with. It's not just a matter of, can my supplier ship me stuff because the regulations in its country have now allowed it. It's also, what's the financial health now of my supplier? If they've been closed down for, 2-3 weeks, months, are they still going to be in business? So you need to have a backup plan if some of those suppliers are going to fall by the wayside. And the third thing is, you really need to have eyes on your inventory and how your inventory is positioned. Because that will help you understand where you have flexibility with your product line and where you have flexibility with your transportation and your warehousing capabilities. This is not something you're going to do with the old paper and pencil approach. You need to have sophisticated technology working for you. Otherwise, you're not going to have the visibility you need to make the right choices.
So what we've seen, I mentioned earlier, the issue of the President of the United States putting restrictions on N95 masks coming to Canada, but some 75
Mhm.
countries around the world have engaged in pandemic protectionism and put export controls on medical equipment or supplies. How should the government of Canada and how should Canadian businesses be responding to this sort of a threat?
Yeah, let me first answer the protectionism part. That's something I really worry about, uh, and something that Canada, as a trading nation, needs to worry about. Uh, what I worry about protectionism is that, to me, it's the simple answer to uh, a, a very complicated question. And if you really want to see the damaging effects that protectionism can have, all we need to do is go back about 90 years and look at what happened during the Great Depression, where we embarked on the same kind of protectionist rhetoric and put in protectionist measures and ended up making the economic depression even worse. It's particularly concerning that we have governments in the US and also in some places in Europe that were protectionist in nature even before this happened. And it's quite possible that this will exacerbate their tendency to become more protectionist. Now, as far as the Canada-U.S. relationship, and that's a critical one when you consider how extensively integrated our two economies are. Obviously, like the next few months are going to require constant dialogue between Canadian government and business officials and U.S. government and business officials. Before our call, I spoke with Bob Ballantyne, and he's the head of the Freight Management Association. His members include companies such as Canadian Tire, which have some of the most sophisticated supply chains in Canada and quite possibly on the planet. Given the coordinated approach that we have been able to pull off during the pandemic between Canada and the U.S., the FMA thinks that we can be reasonably optimistic that planning the reopening of the economy on both sides of the border will generally go well. It's not a given, but I think we can be hopeful. But it's important that our governments have their internal plans developed before they begin discussions with US authorities. It's important that Canadian businesses, whether they simply have customers in the US or suppliers in the US, or if they have offices in the US, that communication happen, that they understand what's possible and not possible during this phase.
Can we look at two other aspects of supply chains from the Canadian perspective? The first is domestic supply chains in Canada. As global supply chains have been cut, sourcing domestically has become that much more important. Can you perhaps talk for a minute about the nature of domestic supply chains and what sort of potential problems there are in Canada with that? And also supply chains for Canadian exporters, for example, for Canadian farmers, their ability to get products to other markets. What sort of challenges are there?
Yeah, the biggest challenge that Canadian companies that are exporting across interprovincial borders are going to face is the fact that not every province is going to be coming on stream, reopening its economy at the same time. So you get into that challenge of, okay, so let's say Saskatchewan has opened up, but companies in Saskatchewan may need material sourced from companies in Ontario, which hasn't yet opened up. So how do we make that happen? It's great that we can open up, but if we can't source that material from a province that hasn't yet, how do we make that work? There's no easy answer to that. I know Freight Management Association has kind of floated the idea that perhaps it might be worth considering, rather than opening up by province, that we open up by region. Because the way this pandemic has unfolded, it seems to be that there's certain regions that are doing better than others in terms of having less of impact, being less impacted by the pandemic. But that's easier said than done when you consider all the things that need to be taken into consideration. I'm not sure I see that happening. I think what needs to happen is that supply chain managers are going to have to get very creative in figuring out, okay, that part of where I used to source parts or that plant is not up for the next few weeks. I need to find it somewhere else. But that's what they're good at. The folks that I know that have been doing this for a long time, that's their expertise, being able to keep a lot of balls up in the air at the same time and being able to make things happen like that. So in a way, we're playing to their strength. You also mentioned about exporters. We're seeing something happening right now that relates to that and shows you how much pain there can be. So what's happening with Canadian pork producers, we ship thousands of baby piglets every week to the US. I think in total about 6 million a year. They go to US farms where they continue to be fed until they're ready to be processed. Now, what's happened in the US is that we've had about 13 abattoirs that had to close down because their staff have been infected with the virus. So now we've got a backlog at the abattoirs. They can't take in more pigs. Those pigs are stuck in American farms. So the American farms, having all this excess number of pigs, can't take any of these piglets from the Canadian pork producers. So now the Canadian pork producers are faced with this dilemma of this excess inventory. And the one thing that makes it even more critical is that this excess inventory actually needs to be fed, which is an additional cost beyond the warehousing part of it. So you can see how a virus infecting one or two plants somewhere can have a ripple effect right across the entire economy. And eventually, it may have an impact on us going to the grocery store, and finding that we can't get pork products that we're used to.
Looking at government policy, if I go back to my days as defense minister, one of the areas that we focused on was the so-called defense industrial base. And that meant if we got ourselves into a conflict, would we be able to source the materials that we needed for the military to defend Canada? It's analogous in a sense to what we have now in terms of public health, that we discovered that we couldn't source the materials that we needed, personal protective equipment, ventilators, and so on. Do you see governments around the world then looking at issues related to national security with a small n and a small s, defining it very broadly and saying, to protect our security, we simply can't depend upon global supply chains anymore, and we have to, at least in specified areas, ensure that we have the domestic capacity here to produce for ourselves and have assured supply in times of crisis? Are we going to be changing the whole structure of global trade as a result?
I don't think so, because I think the main elements of global supply chains remain the same. As consumers will continue to want lower priced goods. That will in turn force companies to remove as much cost from their operations as possible. There's a survey that we do every year with our magazines where we go out and ask Canadian companies, what is your major pressing problem for the coming year, right? What's the major issue that you consider? Their major issue is not improving customer service. Their major issue is not adopting new technologies. Their major issue is not expanding to new markets. Their major issue is reducing cost. That has been the same since the Great Recession. So we're what now, 12 years out since then? Every year since the Great Recession of 2008, the answer has come back the same. their main concern is reducing costs. Unless something happens to change that, unless something happens to change consumer behavior in this move towards global supply chains, I don't see it changing. It may shift for a little bit, but over time, it will go back to where we have been in the past.
After 9/11, we saw significant change in the structure of the automotive sector in North America. Previously, manufacturers operated on a just-in-time basis where a chassis could be coming down an assembly line on one side of the border to be matched with a seat coming down an assembly line on the other side. And in just-in-time production, they would literally match. After 9/11, we saw the border become sticky, which meant that the sector responded in two ways. The first was to increase inventory at a capital cost, and then secondly, to insist that suppliers locate production closer to their customers. Do you anticipate the sort of change taking place in global supply chains?
There already has been a bit of a move to start bringing stuff back in cases where people rushed to produce stuff in China and other places too quickly, where it kind of became a herd mentality, where they decided, well, we're going to produce our TV sets in China or Mexico. Why? Because everybody else is doing it. When they actually started looking at their total landing cost and started saying, well, maybe for us it doesn't necessarily make good sense, then they've already started bringing them back. But overall, as long as you can produce a part cheaper, in China or some other place, and transport it at an efficient manner to sell it into North America, that will continue. What may happen is that companies become more willing to build in safety stock. So yes, maybe we do produce most of the stuff, we'll continue producing most of the stuff the same way we did before globally, but maybe we do need to have some suppliers close by just in case something happens. That's more of the adjustments I see. I don't see like a wholesale change to how the global supply chain system works.
Final question. Let's come back to Canada. You were mentioning, as we begin to decontrol the economy and try to restart the economic engine again, it's going to be important for us to be aware of the impact on supply chains and try to ensure that the whole of a supply chain is able to be brought up at the same time. One of the long-standing issues that we have in Canada is the issue of interprovincial barriers to trade, which affects supply chains. Do you anticipate that as a result of the growing awareness of the importance of supply chains, that there may be a willingness within Canada to start to take down some of those barriers, to see the economy in a much more integrated way, and to actually build one national economy as opposed to 13 separate ones? I asked the question with some hope.
Well, well, that's kind of the million-dollar question. I mean, one of the strengths, I think, of the Canadian political system, is that each province is allowed to manage for its people. At the same time, it can be one of our weaknesses at a time like this when we all need to act collectively. Hopefully, this, as you say, places a spotlight on the need to reduce interprovincial barriers as much as possible, because they do act as a barrier to trade. I'm hopeful too that it'll happen, but I guess we also have to take a look at history and realize that anything involving getting every province to agree to something can take a long period of time.
Over 150 years so far, so it may take a while yet. Lou, it's been absolutely fascinating, and as you point out, the irony with all of this is it was the very success of supply chains that makes them invisible,
exactly,
and causes us to be complacent about them, and we then get a wake-up call like this. Thank you so much for helping to educate us about the nature of supply chains, why they're so important, and what we can be doing now as a result of the lessons that we've learned. Really appreciate your being with us.
Thank you. Great to be with you.